Picture a global commodities trader right now. On one screen, there's a live satellite feed of the Strait of Hormuz. It's completely choked off. Massive tankers that normally carry a quarter of the world's crude oil are just sitting there, dead in the water. Global panic is setting in, diesel surcharges are spiraling, and the IEA is frantically dumping emergency reserves just to keep the global economy from stalling out. It's the ultimate doomsday scenario for fossil fuels. So you'd expect the global auto industry to be in a state of absolute existential panic, right? But look at the trader's other screen, streaming live from a massive exhibition hall in Beijing. No panic at all, just an executive casually standing on a brightly lit stage, showing off a sleek 28,000 euro sedan that can add 400 kilometers of range in the time it takes to drink a cup of coffee. What really struck me beyond the sheer absurdity of these two contrasting scenes was the absolute indifference in Beijing. While half the world is hyperventilating over a geopolitical oil choke point, the other half has simply moved on to a cheaper, faster electric alternative. It makes you wonder, are we just looking at another temporary oil crisis? Or are we watching the exact moment the world realizes it doesn't actually need the combustion engine anymore?
So, for our mission today, we are unpacking the sudden convergence of a massive geopolitical energy crisis with the maturation of a hyper-efficient, technologically dominant electric vehicle industry. We will explore how state-led coordination has effectively immunized a massive sector of the global economy from fossil fuel fragility and why legacy automakers are suddenly facing an existential cliff.
Yeah, and to really grasp the gravity of this situation for you listening, we need to dive into the actual physical reality of the Strait of Hormuz, because I think people hear strait and they picture this massive open ocean.
Right, they don't realize it's a massive geographical bottleneck. It is shockingly narrow.
Exactly. At its narrowest point, the strait is only about 21 miles wide, but and this is the crazy part, the actual shipping lanes, the deep water channels that can physically accommodate fully loaded supertankers, those are only 2 miles wide in either direction.
2 miles. It is literally a needle's eye through which the lifeblood of the industrialized world must pass. I mean, under normal operating conditions, you have an ocean of roughly 20 million barrels moving through that 2-mile corridor every single day.
And today, because of the blockade, the data shows that daily flow has collapsed to just over 2 million barrels.
Right, and the magnitude of that reduction is, it's difficult to overstate. A drop from 20 million to 2 million barrels per day represents a nearly 90% evaporation of the liquid energy that physically powers global commerce.
90%, that's just wild.
Yeah, and the global fossil fuel architecture is entirely predicated on the assumption of uninterrupted flow. There is virtually no slack in the system.
Well, because refineries in Asia and Europe, they operate on just-in-time delivery schedules, right?
Exactly. When you sever a corridor that carries 21% of all global petroleum and a quarter of the world's liquefied natural gas, the consequences cascade instantly. You are not simply observing a spike in the price of fuel at the consumer level.
Right. You're witnessing a structural failure of global maritime logistics.
It breaks the entire chain.
But, I want to push back on the idea that this is just a logistics problem for, massive shipping conglomerates. It feels like the ripple effects go much, much deeper than that.
It's not just a corporate headache.
Right, because if you look at a country like India, the situation on the ground has escalated beyond an economic inconvenience. It's turned into a fundamental crisis of human survival.
Yeah, India serves as the starkest illustration of the extreme vulnerabilities embedded in import dependency. I mean, as the third largest consumer of crude oil globally, their entire industrial and social engine relies on ships arriving from the Persian Gulf.
And the craziest part in the research was that the most acute threat they are facing right now isn't gasoline. It's not diesel for their trucks.
No, the immediate emergency is centered on liquefied petroleum gas, or LPG.
Which is primarily cooking gas. This completely shifted my perspective. In the West, we often view oil crises through the lens of transportation, like how much it costs you to commute to work.
Right, the pump price.
Yeah. But for a massive portion of the Indian population, a blockade in the Strait of Hormuz literally dictates whether or not they can cook their food.
The physical dependency there is staggering. I mean, over the past decade, India executed a massive, highly successful public health initiative. They transitioned their population away from burning biomass like wood and animal dung toward cleaner burning LPG.
Which is great for public health, but it created this massive new dependency.
Today, approximately 330 million Indian households depend directly on LPG cylinders for their daily cooking, and the vulnerability stems from their domestic production limits. India is forced to import between 60 and 64% of its total LPG supply.
And let me guess where that comes from.
More critically, 92% of those specific imports transit directly through the Strait of Hormuz.
Okay, but surely a nation of over 1 billion people has strategic reserves for a commodity that critical, right? Like, the United States has the Strategic Petroleum Reserve tucked away in salt caverns for exactly this kind of scenario.
Well, the reality of strategic stockpiling for LPG is far more complex and constrained than crude oil.
Because it's a gas.
Unlike crude oil, which can just be pumped into massive underground caverns, LPG must be stored under pressure in highly specialized, expensive spherical tanks or refrigerated terminals.
Oh, so you can't just dig a hole and fill it.
Because of the sheer infrastructure cost and the massive daily consumption rate of 1 billion-plus people, India entered this blockade with an active strategic reserve for LPG of only 1.5 to 2 days.
1.5 to 2 days. That means after 48 hours of an interruption in the Gulf, an entire subcontinent is facing a physical shortage of cooking fuel. What happens on day 3? I mean, how does a government even manage that?
Well, the logistical triage begins immediately. The government is forced to implement mandatory draconian switchovers to piped natural gas for industries capable of handling it.
Just to save the cylinders for regular people.
Purely to reserve the remaining LPG cylinders for residential use. And then refineries are frantically altering their cracking processes to prioritize LPG output over other fuels. But of course, that then creates downstream shortages of diesel and naphtha.
It's like squeezing a balloon. You fix one problem and create 2 more.
And they are simultaneously attempting to secure spot market emergency contracts from the United States. But, and here's the kicker, those American shipments now have to bypass the Red Sea entirely.
Because of the blockade, so they have to go all the way around Africa.
Routing all the way around the southern tip of Africa, the Cape of Good Hope. That adds weeks of transit time and catastrophic insurance premiums. It is a desperate scramble to keep society functioning.
It just illustrates how bizarrely interconnected the global economy is. And, the disruption doesn't even stop at cooking gas or diesel. The sources point to these hidden, almost invisible casualties of the blockade. I want to shift gears and talk about helium.
Oh, the global helium supply chain is a perfect case study in unforeseen fragility.
And for you listening, when we talk about helium, we need to completely erase the image of party balloons from our minds. We are not talking about balloons.
Helium is a byproduct of natural gas extraction, and its unique chemical properties make it completely irreplaceable in several high-tech industries.
Right, because it's chemically inert, and crucially, it has the lowest boiling point of any element in the universe. It remains a liquid down to nearly absolute zero.
Which makes it the only substance on Earth capable of superconducting magnets.
We're talking about the massive magnets inside MRI machines at your local hospital and the complex cooling systems used inside semiconductor fabrication plants.
And the geographical concentration of helium production is the vulnerability here. The state of Qatar operates a massive liquefied natural gas processing facility known as Ras Laffan.
And they pull the helium out of the natural gas, right?
As they process the natural gas, they extract the trace amounts of helium. Qatar alone provides roughly 33% of the entire global helium supply.
1/3 of the global supply from one country.
And every single drop of that Qatari helium must be exported on specialized ships sailing right through the Strait of Hormuz.
So the absolute second the strait closes, that entire supply vanishes. Like, the reports indicate that Qatar Energy had to issue declarations of force majeure. Let's define that term for the listener because it sounds like a boring legal technicality, but the physical consequences are massive.
Force majeure is a legal clause in contracts that translates to superior force. It essentially frees a company from liability or obligation when an extraordinary event or circumstance beyond their control prevents them from fulfilling a contract.
An act of God, basically.
So when Qatar Energy invoked force majeure, they were signaling to the world that the roughly 200 highly specialized cryogenic ISO containers of liquid helium sitting at their ports were completely stranded. They literally could not deliver the product.
And the market reaction was violent. Within days, global helium prices surged between 40 and 100%.
Because the true danger lies in the operational limits of the end users. Take the semiconductor industry, which forms the bedrock of modern digital infrastructure. They rely heavily on continuous streams of helium to maintain the thermal stability of silicon wafers during the lithography process.
And they don't just have massive tanks of it sitting around, do they?
No, these fabrication plants typically only hold about a 6-week stockpile of helium on site. If a blockade extends beyond that window, you are not just looking at a slowdown.
You're looking at the potential shutdown of global microchip production.
And the medical field is even more immediate. An MRI machine without liquid helium will undergo a process called a quench.
A quench? What physically happens during a quench?
Well, the magnet rapidly loses its superconductivity, the helium violently boils off into a gas, and the machine is basically rendered inoperable. It's incredibly dangerous and incredibly expensive to fix.
Wow. And beyond the medical and technological sectors, the sources highlight an agricultural crisis triggering at the exact same time. The fertilizer supply chain is breaking down.
Specifically, the supply of diammonium phosphate, or DAP. This is a critical fertilizer utilized globally to ensure high crop yields.
But what does fertilizer have to do with an oil strait?
The manufacturing process for DAP is heavily dependent on sulfur, and refineries in the Persian Gulf extract massive quantities of sulfur as a byproduct of crude oil refining.
So when the flow of crude halts, the refining halts, and the sulfur output drops to zero.
India, for instance, imports approximately 70% of the sulfur required for its domestic DAP production, predominantly from those Gulf refineries.
So without that sulfur arriving through Hormuz, domestic fertilizer production just stalls.
You are looking at a maritime blockade in the Middle East, directly and rapidly threatening global food security by suppressing agricultural yields.
You know, when you lay out the mechanics of it, the LPG, the helium, the sulfur, it really feels like we're looking at the design of a failed system. I mean, if you were engineering the global economy from scratch, this is the exact architecture you would avoid.
It is incredibly precarious, yes.
Consider an analogy. Imagine building the most advanced, high-tech fortress on the planet. It is filled with supercomputers, state-of-the-art life support systems, automated defenses, all of it.
Okay.
But the architects designed it so that every single drop of water required to cool the servers, hydrate the guards, and run the generators has to be pumped through one single, unguarded garden hose left out in an open field. If anyone steps on that hose, the entire fortress collapses.
That garden hose metaphor perfectly captures the structural flaw of the fossil fuel era. The entire paradigm of the 20th and early 21st century global economy was built on the assumption that the garden hose would never be permanently pinched.
Right, but now someone is stomping on it.
The current crisis is forcing a violent realization that this architecture is fundamentally incompatible with long-term security.
But, you know, dealing with macro-level concepts like global logistics and strategic reserves can feel a bit abstract. To truly understand the violence of this shift, we need to look at the ground level. We have to look at the individuals whose livelihoods are tethered to that garden hose and how they are navigating this collapse.
The human element is crucial here.
So let me set the scene for you. The air at the Ningbo Port Logistics Depot was thick with the smell of stale tobacco, cheap instant noodles, and the ever-present metallic tang of diesel. It was 3 a.m., the darkest hour of the shift. Lao Chen sat alone in his elevated dispatch booth, the harsh fluorescent light buzzing overhead. Outside his window, the digital price board for commercial diesel flickered, the red LED numbers ticking upward yet again.
A very grim scene.
Yeah. And in the corner of his booth, a small television was muted, showing a looping satellite feed of the Strait of Hormuz. Black smoke billowed from a shattered tanker. The geopolitical analysts on the screen were gesturing wildly, but Chen didn't need to hear the audio to understand the impact. He looked out the left window of his booth. Parked in a perfectly aligned row sat 20 heavy-duty diesel rigs. They were pristine, fully functional machines, but they were silent.
Because of the fuel cost.
They weren't broken. The brutal mathematics of the fuel spike simply meant Chen couldn't afford to turn the keys. In the logistics business, fuel accounts for over a third of operating expenses. The diesel surges of the past month had inverted his profit margins. Every kilometer those trucks drove now burned a hole in his savings.
It's a completely paralyzing economic situation for a small operator.
But then Chen turned his head to the right side of the yard. Bathed in the pale, icy glow of a massive, high-voltage charging canopy, 10 fully electric heavy-duty trucks were tethered to thick, liquid-cooled cables. They hummed with a low, synthetic vibration as high-amperage current flowed into their battery packs. Just 3 years prior, Chen had bitterly complained about these vehicles. He had viewed them as heavy, expensive toys, practically forced onto his balance sheet by relentless local government emissions mandates and strategic fleet transition targets.
Which was a very common sentiment among legacy operators.
Right. But tonight, staring at the burning ocean on the muted television, a profound, chilling realization washed over him. The state's aggressive, unapologetic push for electrification wasn't merely an environmental vanity project, it was a lifeboat.
A lifeboat.
Yeah, because the electric trucks in his yard, pulling power from a grid heavily supported by domestic solar and hydro, were entirely decoupled from the chaos in the Gulf. He felt a sudden surge of adrenaline, the paranoid chill of realizing how close his business had come to total bankruptcy, followed instantly by the exhausted, heavy relief of a man who had survived a catastrophic shipwreck simply because he had been forced to wear a life jacket. For decades, the smell of diesel had been the smell of commerce and success to Chen. Tonight, it just smelled like extreme, unforgiving vulnerability.
I mean, Lao Chen's experience at that port is the microscopic manifestation of a massive macroeconomic pivot. What he is feeling in that booth is the fundamental difference between an economy built on renting energy and an economy built on owning energy.
Renting versus owning. Let's break down the mechanics of that concept, because honestly, it completely changes how we measure the value of a vehicle.
The mechanics are rooted in the physical properties of the fuel source itself. The entire fossil fuel paradigm operates on a rental model. Whether you are an independent trucking operator like Chen or the energy ministry of a sovereign nation, when your primary power source is diesel, gasoline, or natural gas, you are forced to continuously purchase your energy on an open, highly volatile global market.
You consume the fuel, it burns away, and you have to go immediately buy more.
Every barrel of oil, every shipment of LNG represents recurring operating expense. You are indefinitely subjected to the whims of geopolitical conflict, supply chain disruptions, and maritime choke points.
You are forever at the mercy of the landlord.
And as we are seeing in the Strait of Hormuz, the landlord can completely cut off your supply or triple your rent literally overnight.
But the electric trucks charging in Chen's yard, they represent a completely different economic structure.
Electrification, particularly when it's paired with domestic renewable energy generation, shifts the paradigm from an ongoing operating expense to an upfront capital expense.
Right.
It is an ownership model. Once a solar farm or a wind turbine is physically constructed and connected to the grid, it generates electricity for decades with an effective marginal fuel cost of absolute zero.
Because no one can put a toll booth on the sun.
Exactly. There is no supply risk. There is no international cartel setting the price of sunlight. The energy generation becomes localized and sovereign. When Lao Chen plugs his electric trucks into that charging canopy, he is pulling energy from a domesticated source.
He has effectively shielded his business from a maritime blockade happening thousands of miles away.
Right. The battery in the truck and the solar panel on the grid represent a localized hard asset that completely severs his reliance on that vulnerable global garden hose.
But here is the critical piece of the puzzle that the sources highlight. Chen's survival in this scenario wasn't a lucky accident. He didn't just, stumble into energy security. The presence of those electric trucks, the high-voltage charging canopy, the domestic grid, that was the intended outcome of a highly deliberate, long-term strategic master plan by the Chinese state to forge true energy independence.
They looked at the garden hose decades ago and recognized it as an unacceptable national security threat.
And they actually did something about it.
The foresight and the execution are unparalleled in modern economic history. The Chinese state engineered this transition with a level of holistic, ruthless coordination that stands in stark contrast to the West.
Right, because if you examine the regulatory approach in Europe or North America, it was heavily fragmented, relying deeply on market forces, consumer subsidies, and voluntary corporate transitions.
The Chinese strategy, however, was a comprehensive blueprint of industrial policy. They did not simply offer tax rebates for consumers to buy electric cars. They meticulously constructed an end-to-end ecosystem across 5 distinct interlocking domains.
5 domains. Let's list those out for the listener.
It was critical minerals, batteries, electronics, demand management, and infrastructure.
Okay, let's unpack the mechanics of these 5 domains, because this is the actual architectural blueprint for how a nation immunizes its economy against fossil fuel shocks. Let's start at the very beginning of the supply chain. Critical minerals.
Well, you cannot manufacture an electric vehicle industry without securing the foundational elements: lithium, cobalt, nickel, manganese, and rare earth metals.
You need the rocks.
You need the rocks. But the state recognized early on that controlling the raw ore at the mine was actually less important than controlling the complex midstream processing.
Interesting. So it's not just digging it out of the ground.
No, it's how you refine it. They utilized state-backed policy banks to provide massive injections of long-term credit, and local municipalities deployed what are known as guidance funds.
Okay, let's define guidance funds for you listening. How does a local municipality use a guidance fund to secure a lithium supply chain?
A guidance fund operates somewhat like a state-backed venture capital firm. A local government, say a province looking to build an industrial hub, will pool public money and partner with private capital.
Okay.
But instead of just looking for a quick financial return, their mandate is to build domestic capacity. They offer incredibly favorable terms to processing companies. They provide the land, build the necessary roads and water infrastructure, and inject equity capital to build massive chemical refining plants.
So they make it impossible to say no.
The goal is to ensure that no matter where a rock of raw spodumene lithium is mined in the world, whether that's in Australia or South America, the highly technical, value-adding stage of chemical conversion into battery-grade lithium hydroxide happens within the Chinese ecosystem. They essentially built a processing monopoly.
Okay, so they secure the raw ingredients, refine them domestically, and then push them into the second domain, batteries.
The battery is the technological heart and the most expensive component of an EV. The state did not treat battery cells as simple commodity parts to be outsourced. They treated domestic battery manufacturing as a critical pillar of national security.
So they threw their weight behind the domestic companies.
Through highly coordinated policies, they guaranteed massive domestic demand, which allowed companies like CATL and BYD to rapidly scale up their production lines. This scale allowed them to iterate relentlessly on cell chemistry and manufacturing efficiency,
Driving the costs down.
driving their cost structures down so aggressively that they became globally dominant.
Which leads into the third domain, electronics. Because an electric vehicle isn't just a traditional car with a battery shoved in the trunk. It's basically a highly complex network of power management systems.
Yeah, the vehicle is effectively a rolling supercomputer. The state leveraged their already massive, highly dense consumer electronics and digital manufacturing ecosystems. Think of the incredibly integrated hardware hubs in cities like Shenzhen.
Right, the smartphone capital of the world.
They explicitly targeted the development of power electronics, specifically silicon carbide inverters, which are crucial for managing the intense flow of electricity between the battery and the motor.
So they fostered an environment where hardware engineering and embedded software development were deeply natively integrated into the vehicle design process from day one. Then there is demand management, the fourth domain. The state didn't just, cross their fingers and hope people would buy these cars. They engineered the market through structural mandates and massive public procurement of electric buses and taxis, ensuring the factories had a guaranteed baseload of orders.
They manufactured the demand.
But I really want to focus heavily on the fifth domain because it is the most visible and perhaps the most staggering logistical achievement: infrastructure.
The deployment of charging infrastructure in China completely redefines the concept of industrial speed. A vehicle is useless without a refueling network, and the state understood that range anxiety was the primary psychological barrier to adoption.
The numbers in the sources are staggering. By the time of the reports detailing this transition, China had already deployed over 1.8 million public charging stations. To put that scale into perspective for you, that represented nearly half of the entire global total of public chargers at the time.
And they are only accelerating. They instituted binding targets to install over 100,000 high-speed, high-voltage chargers in urban centers by 2027. We are talking about liquid-cooled flash charging cables that can push massive amperage.
And the automated battery swapping stations, too, where you pull in and a machine physically replaces a depleted battery with a fully charged one in under 3 minutes. They completely rewired the physical topography of their transportation grid.
It's an infrastructure marvel.
But wait, let me stop you there and play devil's advocate for a second. I'm looking at this 5-domain blueprint: minerals, batteries, electronics, demand, infrastructure. It is incredibly logical. But the West Europe, the United States, they have massive pools of capital. They have a century of deep automotive engineering history, brilliant technical universities. Why couldn't Western policymakers just replicate this blueprint? Why did they get outmaneuvered so thoroughly in this specific technological race?
And the divergence fundamentally stems from a deep philosophical difference in regulatory approach. Western governments, particularly in the European Union, adhered rigidly to a concept known as technology neutrality.
Technology neutrality, meaning the regulator refuses to pick a winning technology. They just set a goal and let the market figure it out.
Precisely the intent, but disastrous in its actual execution. The regulators set fleet-wide carbon emission reduction targets, but they told the legacy automakers, we don't care how you reach these targets, just reach them.
Okay, so what did the automakers do?
Well, given that flexibility, the massive corporate incumbents behaved entirely rationally to protect their existing assets. They hedged. They leaned incredibly heavily into plug-in hybrid electric vehicles, or PHEVs.
Hybrids. So a car that has a small battery and an electric motor but still retains a full internal combustion engine and a gas tank.
The hybrid was the ultimate corporate compromise. It allowed automakers to mathematically meet the government's fleet emission targets on paper without having to completely abandon their century-long, multi-billion-dollar investments in combustion engine foundries, complex multi-speed transmissions, and existing supply chains.
It's like trying to keep one foot firmly on the dock while stretching the other foot out onto the boat. You feel safe, but you aren't actually committing to the journey.
And while Europe was busy hedging and compromising with hybrids, the Chinese state was acting with absolute singular focus. They actively and deliberately repressed the internal combustion engine.
How did they repress it?
Municipalities literally restricted the issuance of license plates for gas-powered cars, making them incredibly difficult for consumers to legally buy and register. They structurally forced their domestic industry to abandon the old paradigm.
So they didn't allow their automakers the luxury of hedging.
No, they forced a hard, mandatory leap into pure electrification.
And because the state forced that leap early, the Chinese EV industry survived its painful infancy and has now matured into an absolute juggernaut. They don't need the training wheels anymore. The era of the government just handing out broad purchase subsidies to any company building an EV is over.
It is entirely over. It has been replaced by a new regulatory environment that is frankly terrifying to legacy competitors. The state instituted brutal mandatory efficiency standards.
Right, the regulatory shift that took effect in 2026. This fundamentally altered the physics of competition. The government moved away from subsidizing sheer production volume and instituted a strict, unforgiving technical selection process.
There's a very specific metric attached to this new reality. The new binding consumption standard dictates a maximum energy usage of 15.1 kilowatt hours per 100 kilometers for a 2-ton battery electric vehicle.
15.1 kilowatt-hours per 100 kilometers. That specific number represents a massive structural barrier to entry. It completely changes the engineering philosophy of how a vehicle must be constructed. Let's break down the physics of why that standard is so violent to legacy automakers. If a car company wants to increase the range of an electric car to make it more appealing to consumers, what is the easiest way to do it?
Well, in the early, less regulated days of the EV transition, the simplest brute force solution to cure range anxiety was simply to bolt a larger, heavier battery pack into the chassis of the car. If you wanted to go further, you just give it more fuel cells.
But there's a massive physical penalty for doing that, right?
An enormous penalty. A battery pack is incredibly heavy. When you add a larger battery, you increase the total mass of the vehicle. Pushing that extra mass down the highway requires significantly more energy from the motors.
So it's counterproductive.
It creates a cascading loop of diminishing returns. You are carrying extra battery capacity merely to have enough power to carry the heavy battery itself. The overall energy efficiency of the vehicle plummets.
And that is exactly what the 15.1 kilowatt-hour standard basically makes illegal.
Under the strict consumption limit, you can no longer use the brute force method of adding a massive battery. To legally sell the car and qualify for necessary tax exemptions, you must hyper-optimize the entire physical and digital architecture of the machine.
Every single part has to justify its weight.
The aerodynamics must be flawlessly sculpted to reduce wind drag to an absolute minimum. The thermal management system must perfectly scavenge heat from the motors to warm the cabin without draining the battery. The software controlling the power electronics must route electricity with microscopic precision.
And the regenerative braking system must seamlessly capture kinetic energy and feed it back into the cells.
Efficiency transforms from a marketing talking point into the absolute, non-negotiable baseline for corporate survival.
You cannot take a heavy steel chassis designed in 2015 for a gas engine, rip out the gas tank and try to Frankenstein an electric motor into...
No, a retrofitted architecture is too heavy and too physically compromised to ever hit that 15.1 kilowatt-hour mark. The mandate forces native, ground-up EV integration.
And this relentless state-mandated push for efficiency is also acting as an incredible accelerant for next-generation chemistry, right? Specifically, the rapid commercialization of solid-state and semi-solid-state batteries.
The transition from liquid to solid-state chemistry represents one of the most profound technological leaps in the history.
Okay, to comprehend why it is so revolutionary, we need to examine the internal mechanics of a conventional battery. Let's do a quick chemistry deep dive for the listener. My smartphone has a lithium-ion battery. The electric cars on the road today mostly use lithium-ion batteries. How do they actually work on a chemical level?
So a standard lithium-ion cell contains three primary components: an anode, a cathode, and an electrolyte. Think of the anode and cathode as two separate rooms, and the electrolyte is the hallway connecting them.
Okay, 2 rooms and a hallway.
When the battery's charging or discharging, lithium ions physically travel back and forth through that liquid electrolyte hallway.
But the liquid hallway has inherent structural weaknesses.
Severe weaknesses. First, the organic liquid solvents used are highly volatile and flammable. This requires the battery pack to be encased in heavy, crash-proof, thermally insulated steel and aluminum housings just to ensure safety.
Because if it crashes and leaks, it catches fire.
Exactly. Second, and more critically for efficiency, over time, and especially during repeated high-speed fast charging cycles, the liquid electrolyte is susceptible to the formation of dendrites.
Right, so this is a term that comes up constantly in battery engineering research. What physically are they?
Imagine microscopic metallic stalactites. As the lithium ions travel through the liquid back to the anode during charging, they don't always settle perfectly flat. Sometimes they clump together.
So they form little bumps.
Right. And over thousands of cycles, these microscopic metallic spikes, the dendrites, grow longer and longer, extending from the anode into the liquid electrolyte. If a dendrite grows long enough to physically pierce the ultra-thin plastic separator between the anode and the cathode, it creates a dead short circuit inside the cell.
And a dead short circuit inside a highly energetic, flammable liquid environment results in
a catastrophic thermal runaway, a massive, uncontrollable fire.
So because of the constant threat of dendrite formation, engineers have to deliberately limit how much energy they pack into a traditional liquid cell, and they have to limit how fast the battery can be charged.
It places a hard physical ceiling on energy density and charging speed.
So how does a solid-state battery solve the stalactite problem?
By entirely removing the liquid hallway. In a solid-state battery, the liquid or gel electrolyte is replaced by a dense, solid material, typically an advanced ceramic, a sulfide glass, or a specialized polymer.
And the solid material acts as a physical wall?
The solid electrolyte is structurally rigid. It still allows the microscopic lithium ions to pass through its crystalline structure, but it possesses the mechanical strength to absolutely crush and block any dendrite attempting to form.
The metallic spikes simply cannot penetrate the solid ceramic barrier?
They can't.
Okay, so you eliminate the fire risk of the short circuit. What does that actually mean for the performance of the vehicle, though?
It unlocks an entirely new tier of performance. Because the threat of dendrite short circuits is eliminated, battery chemists can safely utilize extremely high-capacity anode materials like pure lithium metal that were previously deemed far too unstable and dangerous for liquid cells.
They can use the really potent stuff now.
The net result is a massive leap in energy density. A solid-state cell can hold 30 to 80% more electrical energy in the exact same physical volume as a traditional liquid cell.
30 to 80% more energy in the exact same box. The implications for meeting that strict 15.1 kilowatt-hour efficiency standard are massive.
It gives automotive engineers two distinct, incredibly powerful options. Option one, you keep the battery pack the same physical size, but you suddenly offer a vehicle with an 800 or 900 kilometer range, completely obliterating any remaining consumer range anxiety.
And what's option two?
Option two, which is far more critical for efficiency. You reduce the physical size and weight of the battery pack by 40%, yet maintain a highly respectable 500-kilometer range.
By shedding hundreds of pounds of dead battery weight, the entire vehicle becomes exponentially more efficient, and you easily clear the government's consumption limits.
And because the solid ceramic electrolyte is non-flammable, you can also strip out massive amounts of heavy steel safety housing and liquid cooling pumps, further reducing the weight of the car.
It creates a virtuous cycle of efficiency. You have a regulatory environment that is demanding absolute flawless integration of hardware, software, and advanced chemistry.
It forces innovation.
Which brings us to the human cost of this technological rupture. If you are an engineer who has spent your entire life mastering the mechanics of internal combustion, this new reality isn't just challenging, it is an absolute existential nightmare.
It renders a lifetime of expertise obsolete.
So let's look at another scene from the sources. The heavy, high-intensity fluorescent lights of the 2026 Beijing Auto Show beat down on Marcus's shoulders like a physical weight.
Marcus being the engineer from Munich.
Right. As a senior powertrain integration engineer for a century-old Munich-based automaker, he possessed an almost encyclopedic knowledge of thermodynamics. He had spent his entire 30-year career mastering the complex, explosive symphony of the internal combustion engine.
Optimizing fuel injector spray patterns.
Perfecting exhaust gas recirculation valves, shaving fractions of a millimeter off piston rings to reduce friction. He knew it all. But now he was standing beside his company's latest flagship electric vehicle, nervously using a microfiber cloth to wipe a microscopic smudge off the pristine aerodynamic hood. 2 years ago, his team in Germany had designed this heavy, luxurious chassis specifically to exploit the broad, generous purchase subsidies previously offered by the Chinese government.
It was an adaptation of a legacy platform.
Yeah.
A heavy compromise.
Yeah. But the rules had changed virtually overnight. The broad subsidies had evaporated, replaced by the brutal, uncompromising 15.1 kilowatt-hour consumption standard. Marcus watched the endless streams of industry analysts and consumers flow right past his company's massive booth. Their eyes and their cameras were entirely locked on a domestic Chinese startup's display directly across the aisle.
And that startup didn't even exist 5 years ago.
They didn't even exist. Yet on their brightly lit stage, they were demonstrating a natively integrated solid-state thermal management system that unified the battery cooling, motor scavenging, and cabin climate control into a single, flawless, ultra-efficient loop. Marcus's team in Munich had spent the last 6 months analyzing the startup's patents. They realized they couldn't even reverse engineer the system without entirely tearing up their own legacy vehicle architecture.
Which would cost billions.
His company had just spent billions of euros frantically optimizing their existing heavy platform simply to squeak past the new Chinese tax exemption baseline. The executives in Munich were celebrating the fact that they were legally allowed to sell the car, surviving. But across the aisle, the startup was operating on a completely different technological plane. Marcus touched the cold metal of his company's flagship car, feeling a profound, hollow absurdity settle into his chest. They had built a flawless, luxurious, beautifully upholstered machine. But in this new, unforgiving era of efficiency-driven slaughter, his company's 100-year legacy felt like an antique, beautifully crafted grandfather clock ticking quietly in a room full of supercomputers.
If we pull back from Marcus's personal sense of obsolescence and look at the macroeconomics, his experience is the perfect microscopic illustration of a massive structural vulnerability. In economic literature, this phenomenon is widely known as the curse of incumbency.
The curse of incumbency. This is a concept that requires a deep dive because on the surface it seems completely counterintuitive. Well, when you look at a legacy automaker like VW, BMW, or Ford, they have bottomless financial resources. They have century-old brand equity, global dealership networks, and thousands of brilliant engineers like Marcus. How can possessing massive dominant success ever be considered a curse?
To unravel that paradox, we have to look through the lens of neo-Schumpeterian economic theory, which focuses heavily on the mechanics of technological disruption and creative destruction. Legacy automakers are effectively trapped in a prison built by their own historical success.
Trapped by their own success.
They are burdened by what economists define as massive asset specificity.
Asset specificity. Let's translate that into physical, real-world constraints for the listener. What exactly are these highly specific assets?
They fall into two major categories: physical and organizational. On the physical side, consider a company that has spent 80 years perfecting the internal combustion engine. They have tens of billions of dollars permanently sunk into highly specialized infrastructure. They own massive foundries designed specifically to cast aluminum engine blocks.
Right, huge, expensive factories.
They own sprawling factories filled with bespoke tooling dedicated entirely to machining complex 10-speed automatic transmissions. You cannot simply flip a switch and convert an engine block foundry into a clean room facility for manufacturing delicate semiconductor wafers or chemical battery cells. The physical asset is highly specific to the dyeing technology.
It's stranded capital,
Yeah.
but it goes beyond just the physical machines, right? It's the human element, too.
The organizational asset specificity is often far more paralyzing. A legacy automaker has deep, entrenched institutional knowledge based entirely on mechanical engineering. Their middle management structures are designed to oversee complex mechanical supply chains.
And their suppliers, too.
They are locked into rigid long-term contracts with a massive network of Tier 1 suppliers who also specialize in pistons, spark plugs, and exhaust systems. Furthermore, their labor unions are organized around the workforce required to assemble an engine with 2,000 moving parts, not an electric motor with 20 moving parts. Every single process, relationship, and skill set within the corporation is tightly coupled to the legacy technology.
I want to use an analogy to clarify this. It feels like examining a wildly successful, globally dominant mechanical typewriter company in the late 1980s, right at the dawn of the personal computer revolution. This company owns the finest metal stamping machines in the world. They have exclusive contracts with the best ink ribbon suppliers. Their engineers are undisputed masters of mechanical key resistance. But when the transition to digital word processors begins, all of their expertise becomes useless. Instead of acknowledging that the mechanical era is over and attempting to build a computer from a blank sheet of paper, they try to leverage their existing assets.
They try to bridge the gap.
They take their heavy, complex mechanical keyboard and awkwardly glue a tiny LCD screen to the top of it. They create a compromised hybrid because they cannot bear the financial pain of writing off their legacy foundries.
That analogy perfectly encapsulates the strategic trap of hedging. And as we discussed earlier regarding European regulatory policy, the concept of technology neutrality provided a state-sanctioned safety net for that exact behavior.
Right, by allowing the plug-in hybrids.
By allowing plug-in hybrids to count heavily toward corporate emissions targets, regulators essentially told the typewriter companies that their LCD screen hybrids were perfectly acceptable. The policy environment actively de-risked their sunk investments.
It enabled their denial.
It allowed incumbents to rationally choose the path of least resistance, extending the lifespan of their dominant profitable combustion technology, rather than forcing them to embrace the massive, painful financial write-downs required to pivot fully and aggressively to pure electric architectures.
But wait, let me interrupt and test this theory against the reality in Asia. Because if the curse of incumbency is a universal economic law, what about the massive automotive incumbents operating within China? They had giant companies building millions of gas cars, too.
Yes, they did.
I specifically want to analyze Geely. Geely was a colossal incumbent. They literally purchased Volvo to acquire their internal combustion engineering expertise. They had the exact same engine foundries, the exact same specialized supply chains, and the exact same organizational inertia as the European legacy makers.
They were the very definition of an incumbent.
According to the neo-Schumpeterian theory, Geely should have been crushed by their own sunk costs.
You have identified the critical variable that proves the rule. Geely is the ultimate counterexample, and their survival highlights the immense power of the state. Geely was indeed a massive internal combustion behemoth. Left entirely to their own corporate devices in a free, unregulated market, they likely would have followed the exact same hedging strategy as their Western counterparts.
But they didn't. Today, Geely is an absolute powerhouse in the pure electric vehicle sector. So how did they leap across the technological chasm without falling in?
The defining difference was the institutional and regulatory environment enclosing the firm. The Chinese state engineered a domestic market where holding onto the internal combustion engine became mathematically, legally, and politically impossible.
Right, through the repressed license plates and the efficiency standard.
Through the coordinated repression of ICE vehicle license plates, the aggressive scaling of charging infrastructure, and most importantly, the implementation of those brutal 15.1 kilowatt-hour efficiency standards, the state systematically dismantled the value of Geely's legacy assets.
So the curse of incumbency only results in corporate death if the government allows the corporation to be lazy and hedge its bets.
That is exactly the dynamic. The state essentially burned the boats on the shore. They made it abundantly clear that the legacy technology was a dead end. Faced with absolute state-mandated extinction if they clung to combustion, Geely was disciplined into undertaking the massive, painful internal restructuring necessary to leapfrog into EVs.
They survived not despite the state's intervention, but because the state's intervention forced them to abandon their comfort zone. And this forced evolution, this trial by fire, created absolute corporate titans. If we compare the struggle of legacy automakers trying to transition to a company that was born in the new paradigm, the structural differences are staggering.
Let's talk about BYD, because BYD represents an entirely different evolutionary path. They didn't have to burn any boats because they never owned any gas engine foundries to begin with.
BYD is the ultimate manifestation of the new paradigm. As you noted, they did not originate as an automotive manufacturer. They were founded in 1995 purely as a battery manufacturer, primarily building rechargeable batteries for early mobile phones, which is wild to think about now.
When they eventually decided to enter the automotive sector, they didn't try to adapt a car to fit a battery. They quite literally designed the entire architecture of the car around the chemical reality of the battery cell,
which gave them an unparalleled fundamental advantage in vertical integration. While Western automakers spent the late 20th century embracing globalization, outsourcing every possible component to specialized Tier 1 suppliers, and focusing only on final assembly and brand marketing, BYD did the exact opposite. They integrated nearly every single step of the supply chain internally.
The depth of their vertical integration is difficult for Western legacy makers to comprehend. BYD doesn't just assemble the car. They process the raw lithium. They manufacture their own proprietary battery cells. They design and fabricate their own power electronics and semiconductors.
And the motors too, right?
They build their own electric motors. They write their own embedded software. They even manufacture their own seats and dashboards. By controlling the entire physical and digital stack, they completely eliminate the profit margins of dozens of middlemen suppliers.
And what does that level of vertical integration actually translate to on a spreadsheet? Because we have specific numbers on this from the research.
The financial impact is a brutal structural cost advantage. Detailed industry analyses indicate that BYD's deep vertical integration, combined with their proprietary cell-to-pack battery technology, grants them a baseline cost advantage of roughly $2,369 per vehicle compared to their global competitors.
Over $2,300 of pure cost advantage baked into every single car rolling off the lines. In a global automotive market where profit margins are razor thin and achieving price parity is the ultimate battleground, a $2,369 baseline advantage isn't just a competitive edge. It is a devastating, almost insurmountable weapon.
It allows them to aggressively underprice legacy competitors while still maintaining profitability. And now, this highly optimized, natively integrated, software-defined electric architecture that was forged in the crucible of the domestic Chinese market is no longer contained within its borders.
Because the domestic market has reached a point of saturation.
And this massive industrial capacity is spilling outward.
Which brings us to the global macroeconomic impact. This massive outward push is being characterized by economists as the second China shock, and it is colliding directly with the global legacy markets at breakneck speed.
The sheer scale of this export wave is historic and highly disruptive. The data indicates an annual export volume approaching 5 million fully electric and heavily electrified units.
5 million units.
And while Western media and policymakers intensely focus on the fact that Chinese EV market share within the European Union has rapidly climbed to 7%, the truly seismic permanent structural shifts are occurring outside of the traditional Western.
Right. The real battlefield isn't necessarily convincing a buyer in Munich to switch brands. The explosive exponential growth is happening in the global south or across Southeast Asia, Latin America, and emerging markets in Africa.
These are the critical global growth markets. These are populations where vehicle ownership is rapidly expanding. And the rapid penetration of highly efficient, cost-competitive EVs into these markets is signaling a permanent technological leapfrog.
They're skipping a step.
Exactly. Developing nations are increasingly bypassing the legacy combustion engine era entirely.
And this specific export wave arriving at the exact same moment that the Strait of Hormuz crisis is violently exposing the fragility of fossil fuel logistics is completely destroying one of the most deeply held fundamental narratives in the global energy sector. It is destroying the myth of liquefied natural gas as the ultimate necessary transition fuel.
The collapse of the LNG transition narrative is perhaps the most profound geopolitical consequence of this convergence. For the last 20 years, the prevailing consensus among energy economists was that developing economies, particularly in rapidly industrializing regions of Asia, would naturally use imported LNG as a bridge.
Right. Burn gas instead of coal for a while.
They would burn natural gas to transition their grids away from dirty coal, and then, perhaps decades in the future, when the technology matured, they would finally transition to renewables. LNG was viewed as the necessary, pragmatic middle step.
But the Hormuz crisis just shattered the core logic of that bridge. It proved, in real time, that relying on massively expensive, highly specialized imported LNG shipments is geopolitically and economically just as dangerous as relying on imported crude oil.
Because if the strait closes, your transition fuel stops arriving and your grid goes dark.
The security risk of LNG imports is massive. And simultaneously, the electric vehicles arriving on the shores of these developing nations are no longer the heavily compromised, short-range compliance cars that defined the early days of the EV industry. The technological leap driven by the efficiency standards we discussed has completely altered the value proposition. We are now seeing mass production models, like the XPeng GX or the BYD Han-L, entering these markets boasting true driving ranges of 700 to 750 kilometers on a single charge.
750 kilometers.
Yeah.
That entirely eliminates the concept of range anxiety for a consumer in Southeast Asia.
And critically, because of the vertical integration and massive economies of scale, the upfront purchase price of these vehicles has dropped to absolute parity with, or in some cases even below, the cost of a comparable legacy internal combustion engine vehicle.
Therefore, the calculus for a policymaker in a developing nation completely shifts. Why would a sovereign government commit to borrowing billions of dollars, taking on massive national debt, to construct incredibly complex, highly vulnerable coastal LNG import terminals, merely to lock their economy into decades of paying rent for imported fossil fuels?
Especially when they are watching those tankers get blocked in real time.
When, simultaneously, they can import technologically superior electric vehicles that cost less than gas cars and power those vehicles using domestic solar arrays that provide sovereign, localized energy security.
There is absolutely no rational economic or strategic argument for delaying the transition. The transition fuel bridge is obsolete. Nations are realizing they can skip straight to the end game of localized electrification.
And this rapid, accelerated adoption is already having a highly measurable, undeniable macroeconomic impact on global oil demand. We are not talking about future projections. We are talking about demand destruction happening right now.
The data regarding demand destruction is concrete, right?
According to comprehensive analysis by the energy think tank Ember, the current global fleet of electric vehicles is already actively displacing an estimated 1.7 million barrels of oil demand every single day.
1.7 million barrels of oil per day simply erased from the global ledger. Let's contextualize the sheer size of that number for the listener.
To put that volume into geopolitical perspective, 1.7 million barrels per day is roughly equivalent to 70% of Iran's total daily oil exports.
70% of an entire petrostate's output, just gone.
It represents a massive gaping hole in global demand that will simply never return. The combustion engines that would have burned that fuel no longer exist.
And the domestic economic savings generated by this shift are staggering. China alone, purely by utilizing its current massively scaled domestic fleet of EVs instead of importing the equivalent oil, is actively retaining over $28 billion a year within its own economy.
$28 billion.
Money that stays in local municipalities, funds domestic infrastructure, and supports domestic jobs instead of being wired to an overseas landlord.
Consequently, the macroeconomic concept of peak oil demand, the theoretical tipping point at which global oil consumption reaches its absolute maximum before beginning a terminal permanent decline, is no longer a debate about the distant 2030s or 2040s.
It's happening right in front of us.
The convergence of highly efficient EV technology and aggressive state deployment has structurally and irreversibly brought that timeline forward. The energy transition is no longer a hypothetical future scenario. It is an active mechanism aggressively eroding the foundational economics of the global fossil fuel industry today.
When you look at the totality of what we've discussed, from the burning tankers in the Gulf to the hyper-efficient battery architectures in Beijing, it feels like the world has essentially discovered the ultimate geopolitical firewall. For over a century, modern civilization has organized its entire global security apparatus around a central vulnerability. We built massive navies to protect narrow maritime straits. We fought wars to guard vulnerable pipelines.
We tolerated massive supply chain fragility just to keep the liquid fuel flowing.
But you cannot institute a naval blockade against the sun. You cannot place an embargo on the wind. And once a natively integrated solid-state battery is bolted into the chassis of a vehicle and charged with localized power, no foreign power on Earth can cut off its fuel supply.
To synthesize the core macroeconomic and geopolitical themes we have dissected today, we are currently witnessing a profound, irreversible historical pivot. On one side of the ledger, we observe the terrifying fragility of a legacy global economy permanently tethered to a narrow geographical choke point, where a single maritime disruption threatens the fundamental availability of food, fuel, and critical medical supplies for billions of people.
The ultimate fragility.
Contrasted sharply against this vulnerability is the undeniable resilience of a rapidly maturing, relentlessly state-coordinated electrotech ecosystem, a comprehensive industrial architecture that treats technological efficiency not as a marketing luxury, but as the absolute ultimate currency of national survival and economic independence.
When history looks back at this decade, the internal combustion engine won't be recorded as having died from environmental guilt. It will be recorded as having succumbed to the simple, ruthless mathematics of geopolitical risk and technological obsolescence.